Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we will be recapping Day 7 of the second round of the NHL playoffs. And the first game of the day was Dallas versus Colorado. The Stars looking to take a 3-1 series lead, and they would manage to do exactly that with a 5-4 victory. It would start off with 3 straight goals from the Dallas Stars, coming off the backs of Klingberg, Faksa, and Jamie Benn. Then the Avalanche would begin to close in on that lead, goals from Nichushkin and Makar. However, the Stars would then get another couple that would come from Hintz and Guryanov. The Avalanche would make it quite close. Nichushkin would score just a couple minutes later, and in the last dying seconds, literally, in like 3-4 seconds left in the period, Nemesnikov would make it 5-4, but there would not be nearly enough time to actually tie this game, and the Stars would get the victory. Good news for the Stars. I'm continuing to wait for the moment where the Stars' offensive powerhouse that they seem to have become will fall off, and yet it seems like it's not doing. I don't think anyone was expecting the Stars team that we saw in the regular season, which was in the bottom half of the league in terms of scoring, I believe in the bottom third in the league in scoring during the regular season, would come out and just put up so many goals here in this first and second round, even in games where they haven't scored many goals. Let's say the game that they got shut out by the Flames, game 3 in the first round, it was a game where they probably could have had many goals had it not been for really bad bounces and great goaltending from Cam Talbot. So right now the Stars are just sort of at scoring at will, I guess could be one way to put it. And it's not that their game is without problems, but basically the situation is that they're outscoring all of their problems at this point, because these games are still rather close, but when you score 5 goals in the game, you're not normally going to lose. But that does bring us to the bad news, as has been the bad news for the Stars. Anton Khudobin, this third goal that he lets in on Nichushkin, it's an unfortunate bounce immediately off of Nichushkin's shot that goes off of a skate and takes a strange deflection, but the shot is from so far out that this is still one Khudobin needs to react quicker to and make the save on, and so he's just continuing to not be great. He's out-dueling the Avalanche goaltender, but that's really not saying all that much. And so this can be a problem for the Stars, as I've said multiple times in the past. Moving forward in this series, it's possible that they continue to outscore these problems and they win this series in the end, but it could end up catching up to them. I don't know if they can actually score 5 goals a game every single game. On to the Avalanche. The good news for them is that, they're not playing poorly. Every single series thus far in the second round is right now 3-1, and the Avalanche are the team, one of the teams that have only a single win in their series, and yet they're probably the team that I would be least surprised to see actually make a comeback in their series. The Canucks, the Flyers, the Bruins, not so much, haven't looked all that great in their series, but the Avalanche, a couple bounces here or there, and they could have been tied in this series, maybe even up 3-1 themselves. So they're scoring a lot, which is also good to see, even if they are getting outscored by the Stars. But that brings us to the bad news. I didn't think the injury of Philip Grubauer back in Game 1 of this series was going to be a huge deal, but it seems like that's the case. Francouz has not stepped up to the plate at all. He lets in these 3 early goals. I was actually kind of surprised they didn't just pull him at that point, but then he eventually would end up getting pulled, which I thought was kind of funny because of the fact that the 4th goal scored by the Dallas Stars by Hintz was one Francouz needs to have. And so I thought if you were going to pull Francouz at a point, you would do it right there. But then the 5th goal was entirely on his defenseman, Cale Makar, who just makes not a bad play because it sort of was just a bad bounce, but still definitely on Cale Makar, that goal. And so getting him pulled at that point was sort of a bit strange, but still 5 goals led in the game. He seems to be letting in basically 5 goals per game at this point. It's not nearly good enough, and the Avalanche might be getting sunk here in this series, in these playoffs, by their goaltending that wasn't supposed to be a strong suit coming in, but was supposed to hold up relatively well for their, expected deep run in these playoffs. The next game of the day was Islanders versus Flyers, the second game of this back-to-back, and the Islanders would win for the second time in a row here by a score of 3-2. And so this would start off with a Brock Nelson goal tied up by Couturier, but then Pajot and Nelson would make it 3-1. Provorov in the last minute or so of the third period would make it interesting, but the Flyers would not have a third goal in them, and the Islanders would take it and now lead the series 3-1. Good news For the Islanders, they're once again getting the victory here. They actually decided to go with Thomas Greiss on the second half of a back-to-back instead of going back with Semyon Varlamov, who had a really good Game 3. And so this basically just goes to show with Greiss's fantastic game here tonight is that it's not necessarily the goaltenders for the Islanders that are such bright stars, but instead it's mostly just the way the Islanders play that really help out their goaltender. That's not to say Greiss did not have a good game. He was very good in this game, actually. But it's just to show that both of these goaltenders are very capable because just the system that the Islanders plays really complements really any goaltender that they could have, not just Greiss or Varlamov at this point. The bad news for the Islanders is that this was probably their first shaky-ish game of this series thus far. This is the first time in these playoffs, not just in this series, that they've actually given up more than 30 shots. I believe the Flyers had 38. And so it's a moment where I'm not super worried about the Islanders. It honestly wouldn't really surprise me if they actually do manage to close this series off in 5 games. But it is something to take note of, is that the Flyers are getting somewhat closer. The Islanders are going to have to stomp that out and stop getting outplayed for such heavy stretches of these games. It's sort of strange because I pointed out in the previous game that the Flyers were getting maybe 20 minutes of good time, good play, and then 40 minutes of not much. But that sort of on the other side of that coin, why is it that the Islanders in some of these games, for whatever reason, in a specific period, tonight it was the second period, they just decide to not show up? It's sort of strange, and it hasn't really cost them all that much in this series, but it could be something to watch out for if the Flyers can play a bit more consistently moving forward. On the Flyers side, the good news is basically what was the bad news for the Islanders, is that this has been an improvement of their play in this game. Maybe not their best game of the series, as you could argue that the Game 2 that they won was better, but honestly, this wasn't all that bad. It wasn't great either, but it wasn't all that bad. Brian Elliott ended up getting the start here tonight because of the second half of the back-to-back. They didn't want to go with Carter Hart because Carter Hart in the second half of a back-to-back in the first series against the Canadiens didn't really work out all that well. Elliott was decent. The second goal that he gave up, which was to Pajot, was not a good one at all, and I guess you could say it ended up costing them, considering they only won by a single goal, but still, I guess Elliott was okay. Hart will absolutely be back for Game 5. But on to the bad news for the Flyers. I had mentioned after Game 1 that these top players for the Flyers needed to step up, and then going into Game 2, Kevin Hayes scored a couple goals. Couturier scored one as well. Now here tonight, Couturier gets another. But I think the elephant in the room is, where is Claude Giroux at this point in this series? He's the best forward on the Philadelphia Flyers. He's been one of the best forwards in the NHL for the past decade. He's supposed to be an offensive force for the Flyers. And through these entire playoffs, including the round robin, which by the way is 13 games, Claude Giroux has a flat 0 goals, which is unacceptable for the top player of any team, not just the Flyers. I don't care that you're playing against Carey Price in the first round and the defensive stalwarts in the New York Islanders in the second round. Giroux needs to have at least a goal during these playoffs. And to make matters worse, it's not that he has 0 goals, but let's say 12 or 13 assists to still be a point-per-game player. He only has 5 assists in these playoffs to go with that. 5 points in 13 games put him on pace in a full 82-game season for, 30 points, which is maybe a third of what Claude Giroux is expected to get during a regular season. So it's just been a very disappointing playoffs, postseason, I guess you could say, for this Flyers top player, Claude Giroux, and he absolutely might end up backing out of these playoffs with the 0 goals. He's probably going to be someone who's going to need to step up here, and it's probably someone you want to see step up here moving forward into Game 5, or else the Flyers might just be losing that series. And the final game of the day was Canucks versus Golden Knights. The Golden Knights would be the third team on the day to take a 3-1 series lead with their 5-3 victory. This would start off with a Pacioretty goal, then tied by Pettersson. Stevenson would make it 2-1 before Horvat and Toffoli would actually get the lead for the Canucks 3-2, and that would be the score heading into the third period. But Schmidt would tie it up early, 3-3, and then two goals from Pacioretty and Carlson would put the Golden Knights up by 2, and they would not let the Canucks get another one. The Golden Knights with the victory 5-3. Good news for the Golden Knights. They are another team who decided to go with their backup goaltender on the second half of a back-to-back. They put Fleury in here, and Fleury was quite solid, actually. A few really, really great saves. There was one on Pettersson in particular with, I believe, the glove, which was just spectacular. He had no chance on this second goal for the Canucks. The first and the third, you could say he had a chance, but those were also really well-placed shots, perfect snipes by both Pettersson and Toffoli, so it would have been kind of tough for Fleury. And so while going into the next game, it'll be quite obviously Robin Lehner back in nets, it was still a solid performance by Marc-Andre Fleury, and of course a solid performance by the Golden Knights as a whole. The bad news for the Golden Knights, I said it just yesterday in Game 3. The Golden Knights had taken 5 penalties in that game, and I said, well, the Canucks didn't score tonight, but they will punish you if you give them another 5 power plays. And what happened tonight? The Golden Knights gave them another 5 power plays, and the Canucks this time capitalized on 2 of them. And so it didn't end up burning the Golden Knights in the end, as that was only 2 of the 3 goals the Canucks would score, and the Golden Knights would manage to put up 5 themselves. But it is still something. It's good that maybe, I don't know if it's good, but it is interesting that they get punished in this regard, so that maybe will wake them up to be a bit more disciplined, because 5 penalties a game against this Canucks team, if you're not able to get pucks past Markstrom, which has been the case for many teams thus far in these playoffs, giving this many power plays and this many opportunities to the Canucks might end up costing you games in this series. The Golden Knights are going to want to close it out in 5, so they don't want to give that advantage there. The good news for the Canucks is, honestly, I thought this was, you could make the argument that this was their best game of the series. Obviously, they ended up losing, and compared to Game 2, which they actually won, you would be surprised to say that this loss is a better game. But, a lot really had to, the stars had to align in that Game 2. Markstrom had to be spectacular. Their top players needed to score on the few chances that they had. And the Canucks as a whole had to come together and block a franchise record 40 shots in that game. That was a crazy effort by the Canucks to get that victory in Game 2. But here tonight, it felt like a much more evenly played game. And had it not been for a couple of really bad bounces that led to the 4th and 5th goals for the Golden Knights, maybe there's a different tune here for the Vancouver Canucks in this game. So I thought it was an improvement, and that could bode well moving later on into the series. But that does bring us to the bad news, is the fact that we're 3-1 down for the Canucks. The fact that we're saying that this was their best game, and yet they still ended up losing. Markstrom was the only goaltender tonight out of the 4 teams that had back-to-backs to actually start their back-to-back, and maybe got a bit punished for that, because while that 4th and 5th goal weren't necessarily on him, the 3rd goal, which was the Schmidt goal early in the 3rd period that tied the game, was absolutely one Markstrom needs to have, and you would expect Markstrom, with how he's played in these playoffs, to have. And so that wasn't great for the Canucks goaltender. And so just all in all, they just seem sort of outmatched in all areas. Tonight, as I said, was an improvement, but still a step behind the Golden Knights on defense, at forward, and even at times at goaltending. While Markstrom has had really high highs here, so has Lehner, and so has Fleury, even, who has actually played a couple of these games. And so he's only played 1 game tonight. And so this is a situation where I don't know how much faith I can have in the Canucks to come back in this series. But that will do it for this recap. The predictions are going decently well, I guess. This first one, not so great, as I had said the Avalanche would win it in 6 games, with the Stars getting this 4th one. They now have 3 in the series, so that can't happen. So while the Avalanche could technically still win this series, it's looking more Stars advantage-wise. Then the second series, I had said the Islanders in 6. It seems quite likely the Islanders will take the series. Whether or not they give another game to the Flyers is still up for debate. And then I had said the Golden Knights in 6 games. This is also a question of whether or not the Canucks can get another game, but the Golden Knights do seem on their way to finishing it off and moving to the Western Conference Finals. Class dismissed.